So from sadism to the temporality from Karl Einstein and Georges Bataille on the childhood of art. Can you hear me in the back? Or no? No, I have to.
Not very well. I can speak up a little bit.
Okay, so I'll try to. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So, the German Jewish poet Karl Einstein, writing in 1930 as one of interwar Europe's most prominent critics of modern art, had the following poetic remarks to make in relation to the recent work of Hans Ab. Quote, which you see here on the screen. When we were children, we ate cakes like Ab's works, made with dough and sugar, which we call dambédés. We devour enemy men and women, animals, stars, and hearts, in order to renew and enhance our mana in appropriating that of others. We chewed up prehistory and lived in the caves. We tortured dolls and assassinated them afterwards. Unquote. Published originally in the journal Document in an essay entitled Neolithic Childhood, or L'enfance néolithique, the passage flagrantly exploits the rhetoric of primitivism, according to which modern European art would be the formal and psychological approximation, if not equivalent, of the art of the primitives. And of course, I put this under quotation marks. The primitives may be prehistoric humanity, modern-day tribal societies, children, or as Einstein's remarks suggest here, all of the above. Ab's wood and string reliefs from 1929, which you see here on the screen, in other words, are at once children's playthings, the cannibals' provisions, and the magical talismans of troglodytes. While the conflation of childhood with prehistory and tribal life is common among early 20th century European commentators, the same equivocation is somewhat surprising in Einstein. By 1930, Einstein's reputation rested not only on his progressive art criticism, but also on several learned texts concerning non-European art and culture, above all the precocious negroplastic Negro sculpture from 1915, whose cover you see here on the slide. Considered the first aesthetic treatise on African sculpture, negroplastic begins with an energetic repudiation on Einstein's part of the Europeans' misguided concept of the primitive, not least the racist perception of living Africans as, quote, people of an eternal prehistory, unquote. Here, Einstein specifically targets the equivocal heritage of 19th century bioevolutionary thought, which, following the notion popularized by Ernst Haeckel, confounds modern-day tribal societies with prehistoric human species. From this, it follows that Einstein, possibly the most critical voice within the widespread phenomenon of early 20th century modernist primitivism, could not have meant to be taken literally when he conflates childhood, prehistory, and tribal life in his essay Neolithic Childhood. Quote, we as children lived in a Negro village in the South, grouped in clans and tribes. Again, children live in the Neolithic age, whereas the enlightened bourgeois adults live around the 13th century. These sentences in Einstein's 1930 essay on Ab must be read rhetorically or tactically as the means of establishing a specific modality of experience, and I'll explain. That childhood is an experiential modality more than an evolutionary phase, that such modality may be recuperated by specific types of graphic and plastic representations. This is not a notion unique to Einstein. In the aesthetic domain, one has only to recall the central role of childhood in the primitivist imaginary of the European Avant-Garde, specifically in the German context with which Einstein is well acquainted, although not completely approving of, in his capacity as expressionist poet and participant in Berlin Dada. Childhood is even a veritable cult, as attested by the use of children as models. In the Brücke group, you see here on the upper left, Haeckel's painting of Girl with a Doll, a real child model. The collection and imitation of children's drawings among the members of the Blau Reiter, particularly that of Gabriele Münter, which you see here on the middle image on the top row, not least the fabrication of children's toys, both in Berlin Dada and in the Bauhaus workshops, the latter an avant-garde continuation of the 19th century practice of Reformspielzeug. So you see on the upper right here, Hannah Höchst's dolls in the Dada Messe, and below in the bottom row, various kinds of children's toys fabricated by members affiliated with the German Bauhaus, like Leonard Feininger, Alma Zierhardt-Buscher, and on the far right, Pokle. But there was also an anthropological dimension. So aside from the aesthetics, also an anthropological dimension to the pervasive interest in childhood in the 20th century. In French ethnology of the interwar period in particular, the graphic and plastic expressions of children is sometimes thought to furnish the elemental grammar of all art forms considered primitive, that's to say prehistoric tribal, as the philosopher and anthropologist Georges-Henri Luquet believed, or to constitute the vestiges and foundational units of myth, as the ethnologist Marcel Griol thought was the case. It is with the latter anthropological context that Einstein's art criticism intersected in 1930, moment in which Einstein was publishing and co-directing the ethno-aesthetic journal Document in Paris. Here you see the two covers of this journal on the slide. In the latter journal, it is not the anthropologist proper, but Georges Bataille, dissident surrealist thinker and the journal's general editor with close ties to the Institut de l'Ethnologie, who theorized childhood in terms closest to those of Einstein. Given the limited time frame, I will devote the rest of my remarks to one particular issue that arises in Einstein and Bataille's aesthetic thinking around childhood, namely that of sadism. I would suggest that the apparently negligible differences between the two thinkers, Einstein and Bataille, on this issue have in fact important consequences for the temporality of form. By Neolithic childhood, Einstein refers first and foremost to the ways in which Ab's work recuperates an experiential domain at the threshold of language, domain whose affective character is essentially sadistic. Here I quote, "As children, we howled incomprehensible verses in a language we invented. We eat up houses, humans, beasts. We were intoxicated by power and sadism." Unquote. Childhood therefore designates the priority of eating before speaking and the substitution of immaterial speech by the physicality of biting, chewing, and ingesting. For Einstein, a similar set of destructive drives is at work in Ab's painted wood and string reliefs, which specifically attest to the sadistic penchant for cutting. The artist, here I quote Einstein again, separates himself from all necks and all neckties. I don't think it's at all an accident. This necktie is again a motif that reoccurs as a kind of icon of masculine, bourgeois masculinity. Ab separates from himself from all necks and all neckties, slices the necks and throws the lascivious front shirts into the trash. Ab cooks, saws, cuts, and by decapitation and dismemberment, he isolates what's decisive, concentrated possession and sadism, unquote. Now, from an art critical point of view, the emphasis on infantile sadism in Ab's works is strategic. It allows Einstein to distinguish Ab, the biomorphic artist, from the mathematicians or hygienists of abstraction, whom he had recently lampooned in the 1929 exhibition review and now again in Neolithic childhood. The strategy may not be entirely honest, since it obliges Einstein to overwrite Ab's more than friendly relationship with the abstractionists. In fact, in that very exhibition review that he lampooned, Ab was in fact a participant. Not only was Ab an active member of the group Cercle Carré, subsequently Abstraction Création, he was also married, as we know, to the abstract artist and designer Sophie Teuber. But from a theoretical point of view, Einstein's critical strategy served to secure a place for the Alsatian artist in the aesthetic thinking of Bataille, author of a recent essay on children's art and sadism. Here I'm showing you the covers of those two issues of Document once again, with the red arrows pointing respectively to the articles by Georges Bataille on the left and then Einstein on the right, and you can see that they succeed one after another. Einstein's intellectual affinities and collaboration with Bataille and his group of ethnologists in his journal Document have been the subject of several important studies. Here I only cite Klaus Kiefer, Rainer Humboldt, Conrad Joyce, even Georges de Luperman. For the present purpose, it suffices to mention that Bataille's primitive art, L'Art Primitif, appeared in the 7th issue of Document in 1930, this issue preceding Einstein's Neolithic childhood. Bataille's essay, consisting of a lengthy review of the ethnologist Georges Luquet's recent book on children's art, could not have escaped Einstein's notice. In fact, one cannot help suspecting that Einstein's emphasis on infantile sadism against hygienic abstraction in part takes after Bataille's very similar argument, namely that the child's sadistic will to alteration flies in the face of Luquet's overly conceptual account of the intellectual realism of children's art. But here, I would like to underline this, it is for the very reason of Einstein's and Bataille's proximity on this issue that a careful reading is in order. One recalls that there is much that Bataille admires in Luquet's work, which attempts to provide an objective criterion for the primitive vis-à-vis the paradigm of children's art, specifically drawings. And interestingly enough, Bataille does not repudiate Luquet's principal thesis, namely that all art forms are primitive, that display the same proclivity to intellectual realism as children's art. Now, by intellectual realism, Luquet means the representation of reality, not according to visual resemblance, but according to conception. Here I'm quoting Luquet, whose book Bataille is reviewing. Quote, "An image is a resemblance for an adult when it reproduces what his eyes see of the object. For a primitive, or in Luquet's case, that would be the child, for a primitive or child, when it translates what his mind knows of it. We can express both the common and the distinctive characteristics of these two sorts of figurative art." It's very interesting, both are actually figurative. Both sorts of figurative art, by calling the first a visual realism and the second an intellectual realism, unquote. That was Luquet. The watercolor and drawing by the painter André Masson's 9-year-old daughter, which you see here on the screen, reproduced in Bataille's primitive art, appears to confirm the point. The child's drawing of a circle, here I'm pointing to this very cute sun here, the child's drawing of a circle with emanating lines, though it bears no visual representation to the sun, is nevertheless an effective representation that corresponds to the intellectual, or say conceptual reality of the sun, namely as a radiating ball in the sky. If Bataille does not repudiate intellectual realism per se, he regrets in Luquet's account the inadequate discussion of materiality or matière, issue around which all of his criticism revolved. Bataille's grievances to this point include the inapplicability of intellectual realism to plastic or three-dimensional representation and the scanty acknowledgement by Luquet of children's sadistic predilection for defacement. Here I'm quoting Bataille. "Children willfully plunge their fingers into coloring materials, into containers of paint, so as to leave traces of their passage while dragging their fingers across walls or doors," unquote. Still more serious, to Bataille's mind, is Luquet's negligence of the phenomenology of figuration. Specifically, Luquet's conceptual approach to Bataille provides no way of acknowledging the emergence of figuration in the course of a progressive alteration of the support. And it's a very, very important point. Because children are prone to sadism, claims Bataille, their figurative representations are not only intellectual, conceptual, but are closely tied to the penchant for the physical alteration of objects, a wall, a sheet of paper, or a toy. Here I give you the full quote. "The figure thus, for Bataille, emerges in the course of alteration. Quote, from a few bizarre lines, chance unleashes a visual resemblance that can be fixed through repetition. The stage represents the second degree of alteration." So the form actually is a temporal process. The stage represents the second degree of alteration. In other words, the destroyed object, the paper or the wall, is altered to such a point that it is transformed into a new object, a horse, a head, a man. Finally, through repetition, this new object is itself altered through a series of deformation. Art proceeds in this way by successive destruction. So the destruction is actually a process of creation. Now, Bataille's phenomenology of alteration presumably is to be corroborated not by Lily Masson's watercolor drawing, but by what you're seeing here on the screen, which is the contemporary graffiti of Ethiopian children. The latter is one specimen in the enormous corpus of African children's creations collected and documented by the ethnologist Marcel Griol in his ethnographic missions between 1928 and 1932, including drawings, toys, very interestingly almost always fabricated by the children themselves, and games. The documentation of children's art for Griol is a function of a comprehensive approach to African cultural history from the lowest to the highest registers. But for Bataille, Ethiopian children's graffiti on church walls serve more specifically as demonstration of his theory of infantile sadism. Presumably, the various anthropoid forms in Griol's samples, now you should know that that's not the way it's collected, so these samples are not lined up this way on the wall. The various anthropoid forms in Griol's samples attest to successive applications of strong strokes upon the support, which preserves the preceding traces like a palimpsest. The strokes belong not to one child, but to many. That's not. We must remember that the support is found in a public space, so it's actually quite open to many children. So that a human figure started by one child may end up altered by the hand of the next child as to become a turtle, a centipede, a grasshopper, and so forth. And all of those forms you can find here, resembling halfway between human and animal figure. This is at least the story that Bataille allows his reader to construct, while leaving out several relevant facts, which one learns only from Griol in the publication that Bataille announces in his essay. Now, these facts, attested by Griol's Silhouette de graffiti abyssin, include the scarcity of suitable writing surfaces and implements for children in Ethiopia who actually do want to write on paper if they were only given more of them. This extremely taxing endeavor of writing or drawing on the hard and uneven support of the church walls, as opposed to the smooth, flat, and absorbent paper of the European child, and the non-negligible fact that the figures depict mostly human beings, especially saints on horseback. In fact, this figure is actually, according to the indigenous informants, is a saint on horseback, not an anthropoid. It's a man on a horse. Especially saints on horseback and clergy in liturgical garb. So children would represent priests, actually, while the young informants decipher, which the young informants decipher without any difficulty for the benefit of the European ethnologists. All of these factors naturally would need to be taken into account before one properly assesses the validity of Bataille's account of children's sadistic alteration. But leaving aside the question of scientific accuracy, the question is whether the phenomenology of alteration that Bataille sees in the Abyssinian children's graffiti is what Einstein has in mind when referring to Opp's sadistic childhood. So the rhetoric is extremely close. Now, on the one hand, nothing seems closer to Bataille's sadistic alteration than Einstein's trenchant claim. Now, here I quote, "Every precise form is an assassination of other versions. Toute forme précise est un assassinat des autres versions," in the French original. On the other hand, the word precise gives one pause, precision being the one visual quality that children's art, graphic or plastic, lacks. In fact, next to sadism, it is Opp's precision that Einstein underlines. Opp is, now here I'm quoting Einstein in a series of citations from the same essay, Opp is anxiously attached to the precise theme of the objects. Opp isolates the facts so as not to drown in the quagmire. The French original is bourbier. Opp oils and varnishes his details, curls the leaves, rounds out the bird's eggs, shaves the necks of polished wood. He divides and fixes the forms, unquote. In short, if Opp is sadistic, he's also incisive. He cuts and slices not because he wants to wreck and mutilate, but because he's concerned with clarity, distinction, and finish. Now, a comparison of the facture, the makeup of Ab's four reliefs with the Ethiopian children's graffiti makes it easy to see what Einstein means. Whereas the graffiti show successive lines applied on the same figure, there's rarely any overlapping of forms in Ab's works. On the contrary, each element is an autonomous form, disc, oval, teardrop, that most of the time is kept from or barely touching one another. While the Ethiopian graffiti attests to repeated and forceful strokes, in Ab there's no question of gesture whatsoever. The fastidious polishing of the edges in the wooden reliefs erase all traces of personal expressionism, and in the case of the string reliefs, which you see here on the right, created out of strings, facture is almost entirely impersonal. The line in drawing or contour in sculpture have been functionally replaced by loops of strings sewn shut on each end. There is furthermore the question of temporality. Those familiar with Bataille's aesthetic thought, we have no trouble in recognizing the temporality of alteration as that of Bataille's famous enfant, or formless, a term that proclaims, according to Bataille, to assault the intelligibility of the universe by squashing it, that's Bataille's term, squashing it like a spider, reducing it to a worm, and finally to a spittle, kasha. The key here is the protracted temporality of destructive alteration, a downward slope moving from the most to the least intelligible. So if you take the metaphors, it's spider, most complex, worm, less complex, and then finally kasha, spittle, which has no form, right? It is this phenomenology that Bataille first demonstrates in a montage of Roman and Gaulish equestrian coins, showing how Roman classical form is progressively altered in the hands of the barbaric and unruly Gauls. And it is the same story that Bataille tells again with Ethiopian children's graffiti, now without the burden of cultural history. Now, with Einstein, by contrast, temporality is not a matter of successive alteration, but of the instantaneous fixing of multiple figurations. So in that sense, I would say he has more affinity with this rhetoric of simultaneity than with progressive alteration. So Ab, according to Einstein, does not as much subject an object to alteration as much as he grasps it in the midst of an intense metamorphosis. Here Einstein again, Ab fixes in his works the culminating points of the most intense shocks, such as birth, explosion of maternal egg, necktie suffocating in a congested communicant, burial beneath an avalanche of leaves, unquote. The fixing is violent, yet the violence is effectuated on the level of form instead of material, matière. Quite a subtle distinction to be made there. Every precise form, as Einstein claimed, and I cited above, is an assassination of other versions. In short, other formal possibilities. What it does not assassinate is the support, which, as attested by Ab's string reliefs, I mean, this is a much clearer, even clearer example. As attested by Ab's string reliefs, does not necessarily have to undergo physical alteration. In Ab's reliefs of the strings, the pliable loops may take almost any form at any given moment, while the strings themselves remain intact, their circumference having been fixed in advance. Whatever form it fixes will preclude others. The oval must be assassinated, pinched in one corner to become a teardrop, you see here, and it will have to be poked inward from all four sides to become a plus sign, which you see here. It has to be stretched by 2 points to become a stick, which you see here in this plane here, but the strings do not have to be cut. Now, having now assassinated other versions, I'm coming to a close, please forgive me. Having now assassinated other versions, however, the precisely fixed form now contains the maximum figural potential. Therein lies the most difficult aspect of Einstein's thought, namely the dialectic between precision and polyvalence. So seem to be quite contradictory concepts, but in fact, for him, this is exactly the schema. The precision is fixed, whereas the latter, polyvalence, is dynamic and metamorphic. In contradiction to Bataille's alteration, which repeatedly destroys the figure ad infinitum, Einstein's fixing is a one-time action that produces a single precise form whose figural, not formal, possibilities are endless. As Einstein writes, thinking no doubt of arbs, navels, and leaves, here I quote, a leaf contains a quantity of divergent experiences, all of which differ from the initial object. Each theme provokes its contrary and slides toward it imperceptibly. So in other words, each theme already has its opposite, so it does not need to be actually altered right there. In short, the difference between Einstein's polyvalence and Bataille's alteration is that between the imperceptible slide of form and the successive alteration of the support or matière. There are thus reasons to suspect that however eager Einstein may have been to adopt Bataille's language, his notion of Neolithic childhood has less to do with the infantile sadism than with recovering the polyvalence of form central to the experience of childhood. Arp regresses experientially only in order to fix, using the conceptual and technical capacities of the adult artist, forms that capture the world before it is divided by rational language, the world in which, quote, leaves cloak navels that are sometimes eyes, and a bird's egg is Oriole and mother at the same time. As the means to conclude the present exercise in the conceptual distinction between Bataille's and Einstein's Neolithic childhood, it is worth underlining what may be at stake for both thinkers as theoreticians of art in the interwar avant-garde. A comparison of Arp's navels and leaves and the Gaulish coin from Artois, the last station of Bataille's montage demonstrating the alteration of the academic horse, provides some intriguing suggestions. In both works, one is dealing with the threshold between abstraction and figuration, indicating that both Einstein and Bataille, notwithstanding their non-interest, if not undue contempt for pure abstraction in art and architecture, were nevertheless theorizing the emergence of abstract form in terms of the dialectical critique and not antithesis of figuration. What is more, altering from Bataille and fixing of Einstein being both very strong verbs, one cannot fail to remark both thinkers' emphasis on action in their respective phenomenologies. The rhetoric of sadism, in other words, may be nothing other than a strategy for recuperating agency, which is a word also Abigail had just used, recuperating agency, in particularly the agency in the transformation of culture. Thank you.